most people would not deny the legitimacy of video games as an art form. At this point in our history, most of the population can recognize the effort that many people put into the medium and understand that it deserves praise for what it is able to accomplish. However, rarely if ever will you see a video game referenced as an outstanding example of storytelling in the field of English. People within this sphere of English studies will often ignore games as examples of thought-provoking narratives. There could be many reasons for this. Video games do have a certain lingering stigma about them which represents a sort of lackadaisical gamer stereotype. People like this surely do exist, but I think they only represent a minority of people who like to spend their time enjoying games. It could be that when a lot of people think about video games, what immediately comes to mind are things like Pac-Man, Super Mario, and Sonic the Hedgehog. When it comes to these games, it can be easily understood why certain people would choose not to classify them as texts. However, there is much more to the sphere of video games than just these simplistic examples. Games can tell deep and thought-provoking stories in a way that is not possible with other media. I believe that it's entirely reasonable to treat a game as if it were a text. When thinking of a traditional text, we usually think of engaging stories that have a lot to say on and under the surface of the writing. Narratives that stick with us and influence us as people. In the English field, people can easily pick out films, books, poems, and plays that have inspired them in this way, and I think that it's easy to see how games can also be included under this umbrella. They can invoke thought, and people can connect with them just as easily as a traditional form of text. For example, Andrew Turley, in his master's thesis, wanted to tackle the question on why video games are not widely considered as texts. He conducted a study in a class he was teaching, where he assigned students to play or watch an online playthrough of the game Undertale. In this study, along with the rest of his research on the topic, he found that games have potential to be much more engaging than books and film. Students were paying close attention to the story without even really having to try. The interactive elements that come into play when experiencing a story through a video game can have a great influence on how someone perceives the story. Video games can tell stories just as well as film in many cases. Many games focus on cinematic shots and narratives to really engage the audience. However, games offer a certain amount of interactivity and immersion that cannot be found in film or written texts for that matter. In many games, the player has a level of control and choice that allows them to connect with the narrative in their own way. Some games will favor letting a user spend a majority of their time playing the game, while others will choose to delve deeply into making a captivating narrative, and that will be the bulk of the experience. When a balance between these two things is struck, is when video games can truly bring someone into their world and tell a story that will stick with people, and give them an experience equal, and maybe even beyond, a good book or movie. An example of a series of games that choose to focus more on gameplay than story is the Super Mario franchise of games. Many people consider Mario to be hugely enjoyable, but you aren't going to get too much out of Mario in terms of thought-provoking stories. This is by design, so that the game can be easily accessible to all ages, but it leads to the games being rather unfulfilling when looking for a tangible and enthralling narrative. Many other games follow this path too, such as The Legend of Zelda, which may have an expansive lore outside of the games, but the games themselves are primarily made for the purpose of gameplay, and the story takes the back seat. An example of a game series that chooses to latch onto storytelling over gameplay is the Last of Us games. Many people consider these, especially the first, to be some of the best games ever made. However, it can sometimes feel like the player is just watching a film as opposed to actually playing a game. The game has a set story that cannot be changed in any dramatic way, no matter the player's actions. The main playable characters are filled with depth, making them interesting to watch, but the player cannot put themselves in their shoes as easily. Some other games like this would be games like the Telltale games, or visual novels. While not exactly the same as The Last of Us, they are still games that are mildly interactive so that they can tell a tight story. All of these franchises have a lot of things to love, but they don't exactly strike this balance we're looking for. A good example of balance between gameplay and storytelling is the Persona series of games. In these games, the player has a huge influence on how much of the story and characters they learn about, while also getting engaging and exciting gameplay. The player becomes engaged with the story because they are deliberately choosing to learn more about the characters. As they engage more with the story and the characters, it brings about changes in the actual gameplay. It makes for an extremely engaging feedback loop. Another game that does this well is the aforementioned Undertale. Undertale is a game made specifically so that almost every choice a player makes will impact the story in some way. The gameplay becomes a part of the storytelling. Games like this are able to make a story stick with the player because they make the player feel like they are part of this story. This is what is so unique about storytelling in video games. Someone can feel so attached to the characters in the world because they feel like they were really there, and they influenced what was really happening. A player does not have to pay close attention and keep notes in order to capture what is happening in the story, because they are experiencing it for themselves. It will take quite some time for games to become fully recognized as respectable texts in the field of English. They aren't a medium that is easily acceptable or as universally liked as something like film, and because of this, many people are not going to take the time to try and teach them to students or discuss them in professional situations. However, if the time does come where games become widely accepted, it will open up a new form of analysis and experience to so many people. I hope we all get to see it, and I hope that everyone can experience the unmatched feelings that games can produce.